Hi there, my name is Dan Silver, and today I'm going to be talking about a research project called The Dilemmas of Spatializing Social Issues. This is a project that I have been working on along with Fernando Calderon Figueroa and Olympia Bidian. Fernando in particular has been a leader in this work, and I want to be sure to acknowledge him. Both Fernando and Olympia are talented PhD students at the University of Toronto Department of Sociology. First, I'm going to say a bit about what we mean by spatializing social issues, and then we'll talk about the notion of externalities or dilemmas that arise from doing that. Our case study for thinking about that is a program initiative undertaken by the City of Toronto called the Toronto Strong Neighborhood Strategy. And this program designated 13 what came to be known as priority areas for investment, or priority areas for short, in the mid-2000s. And the strategy itself was a part of a much broader trend, not just happening in Toronto, towards urban policy oriented towards neighborhood-centered initiatives. These kinds of initiatives aim to address issues often around concentrated poverty and crime by revitalizing neighborhoods and strengthening neighborhoods. And for that purpose, the way that policies were actually undertaken is they're relying on two parallel kinds of processes. One, we call the fixation of spatial boundaries. Specifically, that means taking a map, drawing boundaries around some parts of the map, and then the other process, targeting social policy based on those boundaries. What that means is that the areas within the boundaries are designated to receive certain services, and the areas without or outside of those boundaries do not. And that's the spatialization of social issues. Now, our project is, the major part of our project involves thinking about the dilemmas that arise from that approach to policy. In particular, some of the externalities that may arise from that. Now, to think about that, we draw on the work of the economist Amartya Sen, who thought a lot about that question, that is the costs or externalities that arise from targeted policy in general. And a big part of our paper that this work is based on tries to sort of do some theoretical work to map Sen's ideas about targeting in general onto the case of neighborhood policy or geographically targeted policy. Here, I'll just talk about some of the dilemmas or externalities that hypothetically may arise from that process. One we call incentive distortion. So fixing boundaries and then targeting policy based on those boundaries can affect people's behavior towards the targeting neighborhoods. The targeted or designated areas might become less desirable for potential residents and local businesses by being officially designated by government bodies as concentrations of social problems. And we know from much research that any kind of information that signals that an area is a problem or is undergoing some kind of decline is a powerful incentive, pushing people out of that neighborhood or to disinvest in it. So on the margins, that designation may lead a potential home buyer or investor to shift their investment or their demand a little bit outside of those neighborhoods towards otherwise similar areas that are not designated. At least that's the hypothesis. Another potential externality is what we call informational distortion. Toronto is a very heterogeneous city, as are many other cities, and any part of a map of the city that you draw a line around will contain a lot of diversity within it. That means that if we're thinking about income, there's a good chance that while there'll be a lot of low income areas, there will be many middle and high income areas, meaning that quote unquote undeserving areas will receive the benefits. Likewise, the areas outside of the boundaries will include many, in this case, low income areas, that is quote unquote deserving areas, and they will not receive benefits. That's what we call informational distortion, a possible dilemma that arises from this approach to policy. And the last one we talk about is stigmatization, and drawing areas around a map, targeting it for social policy based on the perception that those areas are sources of have concentrations of problems in them, can heighten stigma around people who live in those areas and businesses and organizations and intersections in those areas. In that process, a bad reputation can become associated with entire areas of a city, regardless of whatever the intentions of policymakers might have been. This can happen through newspaper coverage that associates the label, in this case, priority area, with various negative connotations. resulting in a situation where, for example, let's say a negative or bad incident that might happen in one part of the city would affect the reputation of people or intersections or organizations way on the other side of the city, because they're both covered by that same label, priority area. So the label ends up becoming an all-purpose word for an area beset by various social problems. That's stigmatization. At the same time, we want to consider the kinds of outcomes that the policy was hoping to achieve. And one of the major ones evolved around strengthening communities, that's to say, show social capital. Many of the programs undertaken by the policy were an attempt to increase community participation, engagement in local organizations, youth services, murals designed to increase a sense of belonging and pride, reduction of cost of participation in community centers, trying to promote ways that in which community members could provide mutual support and help to one another, all around social capital. And so we try to assess the extent to which the policy actually might have increased various indicators of social capital. So we want to look at both horns, so to speak, of the dilemma, the potential good things that might be coming out of the policy to the extent that we can, and some of the costs. Before getting into the way we evaluate those questions, I need to say a bit more about the Toronto Strong Neighborhood Strategy itself. Now, it grew out of the amalgamation of the City of Toronto in 1998, which raised many questions about resource allocation, and was sparked by a few things. One was a major report written by the United Way for Greater Toronto called Poverty by Postal Code, which drew maps and showed that poverty was concentrated in particular areas of the city. This came out in 2004. Then in 2005 was the year that became known as the Summer of the Gun, where there was a series of high-profile shootings in particular neighborhoods, and those led to two groups being created. One was the Community Safety Plan, and the other was the Strong Neighborhood Task Force. And between them, they ended up creating these 13 priority neighborhoods to receive extra programming and benefits. And here they are on the map on the left. You can see those in the darker shades, the 13 areas designated in 2000, finally in 2006. And then on the right, just to give a background on the question of social trust. This is from data at the RDC, and you can see indeed that in the downtown core of the city, generalized trust in others is higher, and we get into the kinds of areas that are now being targeted for intervention. Generalized trust is somewhat lower, and this was again part of the motivation for trying to strengthen the kind of community base in the designated targeted areas. So how do we go about trying to evaluate these questions? I'll quickly go through the major kind of methods that we use. For the incentive distortion question, essentially what we do is a process of matching and then difference in difference regression. What that means is we take, here on the map, you can see the blue is targeted areas, and the red are other dissemination areas, the smallest geographic unit in the census. And the red are areas that we were able to match to the designated areas outside, non-designated. We match them based on having a similar economic profile, similar demographic profile, similar built form, and being spatially nearby. That gives us an apples to apples comparisons, and we compare before these areas, the matched areas before and after the designation on their home values, rent, and then building permits. For informational distortion, we look at income distribution in designated and undesignated areas. For stigma, we look at newspaper articles that mention priority areas. We look at the words around that mention, and then we compare those to policy documents, and we also do qualitative analysis of those articles, and as well as looking at prior ethnographic and interview-based studies. For social capital, this is where we really dig into the RDC data. We're using general social survey now. This is ongoing work. We use a similar matching and regression approach. We compare, we match individuals who live in the designated areas with individuals, otherwise similar individuals who live in the undesignated areas, and we compare trajectories of those individuals in terms of various indicators of social capital trust in strangers, trust in neighbors, confidence in institutions, providing mutual support to your neighbors. And again, we take that matching plus difference in difference regression approach. Quickly now, I'm going to move through the results. Here's the results for the incentive distortion. And now what you can see here is the blue lines show designated areas, and the red line shows the undesignated areas. In the middle, we'll just focus on that one. Shows trends in average dwelling values, and you can see that with the vertical line is when the intervention happened, when the designation occurred, and they're following along on fairly similar trajectories. These are the matched areas, keep in mind. So these are otherwise similar areas in terms of income and demographics, geography, and built form, and they're following a similar trajectory. Then we have the designation. And by the time now we're here 10 years later, in 2016 census, the dwelling value between those otherwise similar areas at the time has really, really grown. We see a similar thing here now in terms of building permits, a real divergence that happens after the designation. When we do the regression, and there's a bunch of controls in the background here, we can sort of put a number on it, and we can see that the designation itself, for example, seems to have caused about a $70,000 reduction in home value in designated areas compared to otherwise similar undesignated areas. With information distortion, now this was a common topic of discussion in the newspaper since the designation occurred. Here's an article where we have somebody talking about there's parts of the cities that were not designated, but maybe should have been. They didn't qualify because they're in the wrong postal code. That's exactly what we have in mind with the information distortion question, and it was a concern for many observers and community organizers. We can see the source of the concern here when we look at income distribution. The top show designated areas, and the bottom show non-designated areas that are right nearby to illustrate. And these vertical dashed lines are showing the lowest income quintile on the left and the high upper income quintile on the right. And you can see in the designated areas that there's many middle and upper income areas still, and in the non-designated areas, there's still quite a few lower income areas. And this generalizes when we try to generalize it across the city. So there is strong information distortion that occurred. When we look at stigmatization, we did a text analysis of words, again, near the phrase priority area. And in the newspaper articles, there's significantly more mentions of words, phrases like police, shot, crime, gangs, and violence, whereas the policy document was envisioned by policymakers were concepts like opportunities, equity, investment, participation, services. But once this went out into the world in the newspapers, that phrase priority area became associated with negative connotations, as we see in a sentiment analysis, along with these specific kinds of words like shot, crime, gangs, and violence. This is not just a sort of quantitative artifact. It's a common refrain when we look at newspaper articles discussing this. Stigmatization came up a lot. There's also a common refrain in the city's own review of the program in 2011 or so. Many residents and local youth and even city councilors talked about that very problem. Ethnographic research brought up the same thing. One respondent in an ethnographic study compared living or being designated as living in a priority neighborhood as similar to bad food. It just, let me get the quote here. Just I want to say, it's a good quote, I just want to say it right. They said, when you are still labeled a priority neighborhood now, over 10 years later, it's like labeling bad food because no one is going to want to touch it. No one's going to want to consume it, right? So this that's almost the definition of stigma, not wanting to be touched. And so there's a strong widespread feeling that the designated itself produced that feeling of stigma. Now, on the positive side, what kinds of benefits did we see when it comes to various indicators of social capital? I say this is raw, this is work in progress. To do this, we're using RDC data, the General Social Survey right now. And that's incredible data from the point of view of this kind of study because it gives us access to fine-grained individual information, including the place of residence of respondents at the neighborhood or census tract level in this case. And what we did is we compare individuals who reside in the designated areas with those residing in the undesignated areas prior to the intervention. Now we have the 2003 GSS, and then afterwards, in this case, we had 2008 and 2013, and we're updating that now with 2018 as well. We matched people based on demographic and their economic characteristics. And then we're looking at their differences before and after the intervention. We did it for a number of different indicators of social capital. Response to the generalized trust question, which is in general, how much do you think people can be trusted? We looked at confidence in various institutions. How much confidence or trust do you have in municipal government, in federal government, in corporations, in police, and so on? Questions about, do you think neighborhoods help each other out in your neighborhood? There's the, I'll talk about this in a second, the wallet question. You ask somebody, if you dropped a wallet in your neighborhood, do you think someone would pick it up and return it to you? How much support do you give to other people, and how much support do you receive from other people in your neighborhood? So we looked at all of those questions, and overall we found no impact at all before and after the designation. This, again, rough, hot off the press graph on the right sort of gives an indication of what it ends up looking like in the analysis. This is just basically indicating that in the designated areas, this is the wallet question, people are somewhat less likely to think that their neighbor would return the wallet. But this term down here indicates that after the intervention, there was no difference in that difference. This is still ongoing work. It's only gone up to 2013, so perhaps the effects only appeared later because, of course, trust is something that takes a longer time to build up, and we might not have expect these kinds of programs to produce results that quickly. So we're following up. Other data sets, in particular the Canadian Community Health Survey we've just gotten access to, they have a number of variables that could be of interest, such as sense of belonging to the local community. Those are annual. And again, that might help us to detect some impacts also in terms of health that we might not have been able to detect so far. So it's an open question still, but this is what we found so far. I'm just going to conclude now, just reviewing what we found and then thinking about going forward. So in general, we found that there are some serious dilemmas when it comes to boundary fixation plus targeting in urban policy. It can generate, in this case, incentive distortion. We saw really substantial reduced housing demand and investment in priority areas compared to otherwise similar undesignated areas. We found quite a bit of information distortion, and that comes from the high degree of internal heterogeneity within any boundary that you might draw, at least at that scale. We found much concern about stigma. The label priority neighborhood was associated with negative images in people's minds. And likewise, when we looked at social capital, so far we found little evidence of positive effects, though again, I want to stress this is an ongoing area of investigation. Now, these kinds of concerns did in fact lead the city to revise the program in 2011. They changed the name from priority areas for investment to neighborhood improvement areas. They came up with some new ways of potentially more rigorous ways of defining what came to be known as the NIAs, neighborhood improvement areas. It's been about 10 years since that happened. And we now, after given that amount of time, it's probably a good opportunity to now use these similar methods to try to investigate the longer term effects that we may have seen from that change to the program so far. That's something we're going to be working on now as well. That said, there are signs of concern among service delivery organizations that it might be worth considering alternatives and academics to the boundary drawing approach to place-based policies. For example, some are speaking of place-conscious approach that locates interventions and services not by fixing boundaries, but according to the evolving needs of the community at micro levels, and on the for example, on the model of park or fire station provision. These are, of course, open-ended questions for which the RDC data is uniquely situated to addressing going forward. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm an urban geographer and I research how cities and their neighborhoods change over time in terms of their socioeconomic and demographic composition, their urban form, transportation networks, as well as human travel behavior, such as commuting. One major change that has occurred over the past several decades in Canadian cities is the spatial distribution of wealth and poverty. Generally, poverty was historically clustered within city centers, for example, shown in the red areas in the map on the left, a map of average income in Toronto in 1960. But over the past several decades, many centrally located neighborhoods have gentrified, and there's been growing poverty in some more peripheral neighborhoods, often in apartment neighborhoods in the inner suburbs. The map on the right shows high concentrations of poverty in, for example, in Scarborough and Etobicoke, inner suburbs of Toronto, while central parts of Toronto have increased in wealth. So this trend has been called a suburbanization or decentralization of poverty. Here's another map for Montreal. This one showing the change in average income over time from 1970 to 2005. It might be a bit hard to see, but the central area shown on this map has increased in wealth, has gentrified, but areas in the inner suburbs have declined in average income, the red areas on the map. Where this type of analysis is based on data, census data that's been pre-aggregated to neighborhood-sized census tracts. And so these patterns have led to a number of concerns pertaining to increased sociospatial polarization of urban space. One is that moving and residential displacement from central to suburban areas can have substantial monetary costs, upset social connections, negatively impact well-being. There are also concerns that a lot of these suburban neighborhoods, particularly apartment neighborhoods, have few on-site services and amenities and consist of older and decaying building structures as well. Also, these are some maps from my previous work. This is a paper looking at growing suburban poverty in Toronto and how it's correlated with increased barriers to daily travel and longer commute times as well. So there's also the concern that living in kind of these suburban neighborhoods can limit the ability of low-income residents to travel and to participate in daily activities, so including work, shopping, visiting friends and family, due to inaccessible environments, particularly for those who are unable to afford a car. So part of the motivation, though, from what I'm presenting today, is that most research on neighborhood change, and specifically on growth of poverty in the suburbs, has focused on changes at the neighborhood level. For example, mapping income, poverty rates, or other socioeconomic data that are pre-aggregated to census tracts and showing how this has changed over time. So while neighborhood level studies like this, while important for investigating kind of regional patterns, are unable to directly examine individual pathways to suburban poverty. So for example, inner city gentrification and growing suburban poverty does not necessarily mean that low-income residents are being disproportionately displaced from central to suburban neighborhoods. The observed neighborhood change might be due to upward or downward income mobility of residents who stay in these neighborhoods. So one specific question that I'm trying to answer using data at the RDC is to try to find out how have lower income households agglomerated in the suburbs in recent history in Canadian cities. So what are the predominant individual residential mobility pathways to suburban poverty? So this is focusing on the 9 largest CMAs in Canada, those on the map here, and using data from 2006 to 2016. At a high level, we can conceptualize residential mobility pathways to suburban poverty as kind of 3 broad categories. Low-income residents, the first being low-income residents moving from central to suburban neighborhoods, which would include gentrification and displacement to the suburbs, but also potentially moving out of choice. So for example, wanting to move closer to suburban employment opportunities or family that live in the suburbs. The second is low-income immigrant settlement directly within the suburbs, which can be international immigrants or residents moving from elsewhere in Canada. And the third is becoming and remaining poor within the suburbs. So this can include moving within the suburbs or staying within the same dwelling and dropping into poverty. And we use this kind of framework to try to use data specifically to answer the propensity of each of these pathways in Canadian cities. So before kind of getting into the data at the RDC, we have to first do a classification of neighborhoods based on their urban form via cluster analysis. The main objective of this analysis is to include the suburban status of different neighborhoods in order to subsequently link to the individual data at the RDC on residential mobility. Clustering techniques are pretty common for geodemographic analysis, usually based off of demographic and socioeconomic characteristics. For our case, we use a k-means approach on urban form variables to specifically characterize whether or not a neighborhood is suburban. The variables we include are in the table here, and these were selected based on their on previous studies that measure how suburbanized the neighborhood is, each capturing a different important dimension of suburbanization or centralization, as well as data availability for Canadian CMAs at the CT level. Find that suburban group are two groups. The suburban one neighborhoods have lower population density, more detached dwellings, more housing built after World War II, and worse local and regional accessibility, which are built environment metrics. Here's a map of what the results look like for Montreal, with the blue areas classified as central neighborhoods and the orange as suburban. This plot shows the percent of each CMA classified as a suburb. We find that the majority of census tracts in these CMAs are suburban. Most of Canadian urban areas are suburban, with Edmonton and Calgary being the most, and Vancouver and Montreal being the least. Next, we link this neighborhood typology to individual microdata at the RDC, specifically to the longitudinal administrative database or data bank. This data set is a 20% sample of all tax filers and consists of an annual panel and includes a suite of information that residents note in their tax returns. The main variable of interest using here is the low income status of tax filers. So in the data, this low income status is pre-coded as a binary classification based on the low income measure. And we use this variable as an indicator of household poverty. Importantly, the data as well denote the 6-digit postal code of residents on December 31st for each tax year, meaning they can be used to track individual residential mobility via the kind of income over time compared to built environment classifications as well. So for our study, we use this to link to this center suburban neighborhood classification that I described previously. So first, for context, the figure on the left shows the overall poverty rate within each CMA based on the low income measure derived from tax records. The larger cities, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal as well, have the greatest poverty rate. And overall, though, the poverty rate has declined a little bit over this 10-year period, and particularly from 2014 to 2016. So the black line is the overall rate of all these regions combined. On the right shows the total number of residents under the poverty line living in suburban neighborhoods. And we see that this is increasing up until 2014, until it drops slightly in concordance with an overall drop in the poverty rate. Two more plots here. On the left is a plot of the percent of poverty in a CMA located in the suburbs, showing slight increasing trends over time. However, the overall population living in the suburbs may also be increasing over this period. So in the figure on the right, we plot a ratio of the poverty rate in the suburbs to the poverty rate in the center. Since for each of these CMAs, this ratio is less than 1, this indicates that the poverty rate remains greater in central neighborhoods than suburban neighborhoods, but it's increasing over time. So it means the gap between these two poverty rates is closing. And Toronto and Vancouver are the two CMAs where this gap is narrowest and closing the quickest. So these plots overall indicate, while overall the poverty rate in Canadian cities, at least based off these tax record data, has declined slightly from 2006 to 2016, but poverty in the suburbs has increased both in absolute and relative terms. Importantly, the temporal nature of this linked microdata allows for describing the individual geographic pathways to suburban poverty. So specifically for each year, we count for each year for those in poverty in the suburbs where they were living the year prior for 6 possible prior states. So whether somebody didn't move, in other words, stayed in the same postal code, moved from the center to a suburb, moved from a suburb to another suburb, moved from elsewhere in Canada to a suburb, immigrated from another country, or persons that were born in the past year, since we're looking at the entire population. And then from these counts, we compute the percent or probability of coming from each prior state. This table shows results for average probabilities for different individual pathways to suburban poverty on an annual basis. This is highlighted in the red box on the right. Overall, we find that those in suburban poverty, only 2.9% moved from a central neighborhood, 6.6% immigrated from elsewhere, either Canada or internationally, and while 88.5% lived in the suburbs the year before, most of which did not move. We also find that low-income residents who lived in the suburbs the year prior, 21.5% were not classified as being low income, meaning that the growth in suburban poverty, at least on an annual basis, is much more due to dropping into poverty within the suburbs compared to displacement from central neighborhoods or due to immigrant settlement. These plots show changes in these probabilities over time. There isn't much substantial change, but we do find from 2006 to 2016, moves decreased both centered to suburban mobility as well as moving in the suburbs, while the rate of non-moving increased over this time. So in other words, over time, the source of suburban poverty is increasingly sourced from people staying in the same location. So to summarize, looking at this longitudinal tax record data at the RDC provides the ability and further evidence of looking at suburbanization of poverty in Canada. We find that dropping into poverty while staying in the suburbs encompasses a greater proportion of suburban poverty than immigration or center to suburb mobility combined, at least on an annual basis. We find that a relatively greater percent of non-movers dropped into poverty in the suburbs than in the center as well. And overall, we hope that this disaggregated research is a step forward into providing more insight into broadly the changing socioeconomic patterns of urban neighborhoods and regions across Canada. But that being said, this is really just kind of a first foray into some of this data for these purposes. And we had several limitations in our work thus far. We only used binary measures of low income status, as well as what counts as a suburb. We also only looked at annual change, and one thing I'm interested in doing is expanding to look at sequences of change over time. And lastly, I'm also using the same data to try to examine whether there are income inequalities of low-income residents moving away from areas with good public transit service, as they're more likely to be relying on public transit service. So that's all I have. Thank you for listening, and my email and personal website are here if you want to check out any of my other work.
Today I'm going to talk about how we can do natural experiment study using existing surveys. What is natural experiment? So we can think about how we can evaluate the effectiveness of COVID vaccine. We can do a randomized experiment, and we can go out and select a group of people who are representative to the population, and then we can assign some into an experimental group and then others into a control group. Right? In experimental group, people get vaccinated. In control group, people are not getting vaccinated. And then we can compare the infection rate, the situations in differences in these two groups to reach a conclusion that whether the vaccine is effective or not. Or we can do a natural experiment. So for example, we can look at countries with vaccine available and countries without vaccine available. Then we can compare before and after within the country, the COVID numbers, the trend, right? The over or trend between those countries, and then also reach a conclusion whether countries with vaccine, the pandemic situation, and countries without vaccine available, the pandemic data, right? And then reach a conclusion whether the COVID vaccine is effective or not in controlling the pandemic. So think about what is the main differences between a randomized experiment and a natural experiment. The key differences is that for natural experiments, researchers do not create them, right, but find them. Right? We do not go out and select a group of people to do a randomized experiment, but we use a vaccine available and country differences over time, existing data to create a situation where the vaccine happened to some people, but not to others, right? So natural experiment is we find an event that happened to some people, but not to others. And those events could happen randomly, right? Or as good as randomly, right? It's not designed by researchers, right? So that's the key point about natural experiment. So natural in the sense that it was not planned, right? Of course. So there's two things. One is that natural can be natural, including those natural disaster, earthquake, hurricane, right? It can also be man-made causes, events, right? Policy, terror attacks, those events that happened more like randomly or as good as random that could affect some people, but not others. And then we can use those think of those as a social natural experiment for exploring cause and effect associations, right, in social science research. One point I want to add here is that individual life events along a life course, for example, can also be used as an event that in natural experiment research. I will elaborate this point a little bit more later on using examples. So my research is on trust, right? So this is a standard survey question people ask to measure generalize social trust, whether people can be trusted or we have to be careful in dealing with others. So this generalized social trust is more like a psychological event within the individual, but a social reality. I want to highlight 3 points. One is that this mutual trust people have in each other is very important. It's essential for the overall functioning of the society. It's foundational to social order. Right? And the second is that a lot of research also suggests that trusting individuals tend to be richer, happier, healthier, or even tend to live longer, right? But trust is unevenly distributed among individuals across social groups and also across nationally. So that's why it's important. The widespread of trust inequality could have important consequences, right? So that we need to conceptualize trust as a sociological concept or a social reality rather than just a individual phenomena. So that's why a lot of researchers asking this question: where does trust come from? Right? In trust literature, there's a huge debate between a cultural theory and then a experiential theory. So from the cultural theory, scholars think people learn to trust early on, and learn trust tend to be stable in adulthood, right? And then from an experiential theory perspective, and people like we update over trust based on over changing life experience. And we can learn trust at any point in time along the life course. So how to test or separate between these two theories? We can do two experiments here. So I'm gonna use the Canadian General Social Survey program. Data from Canadian General Social Survey is a very good survey, and the sample size is huge, relative to like small population, Canadian population. We have like, for example, recent survey had 25,000 average 25,000 Canadians being surveyed. So it's relatively is a huge data set. So in Canada, trust is much lower in Quebec, right? So for example, in Quebec, the data 2003, 8, and then 2013, the data shows like in Quebec, about 35% people would say most people can be trusted, but outside Quebec is more than 55% people would say most people can be trusted. And then this gap is consistent over time, right? So I'm going to talk about two natural experiments that can be used to test the theory, whether trust is cultural or trust experiential. One is migration, and then another is the quiet revolution that happened in 1960, during 1960 in Quebec, but not outside Quebec. So in terms of migration, think about migration as a individual life event, happen to some individual, but not to others, right? So over the life course, some people migrate, other people did not migrate, right? So the design is that when we look at there's a huge trust gap in Canada between Quebec and the rest of Canada. So we can ask the question, when people grew up in Quebec, where people trust is low, and then they migrate to places where people are relatively more trusting, do they become more trusting? And then the other way around is that when people who grew up in a high trust environment, for example, in BC or in Ontario, and then when they migrate, move into Quebec, where people have lower trust, do they become less trusting, right? So migration, internal migration as a life event, and then this can be seen as a natural experiment to look at the trust differences between migrants, non-migrants, right? So the finding is that when we analyze the data, what I have shown here is that, for example, panel A outside Quebec, so rest of Canada, those people who who did not migrate, the level of trust is 46%. 46% of non-migrant in ROC say people can be trusted. But when they migrate when people who from outside of Quebec migrate into Quebec, where people tend to have a lower trust, they still have 46% level of trust, right? And then one point about the cultural and experiential debate is that from the cultural perspective, people learn to trust early in life, right? Between age 16, for example, before they finish primary socialization. Therefore, it's very important to think about when do people migrate, whether people migrate as a child or people migrate as an adult, right? So, but when I separate between child migration and adult migration, you can see among adult migration, there's a 1% decline, but relatively this is not significant, right? So this suggests that people who were from ROC, Quebec, BC or Ontario, migrate into low trust Quebec, they did not become less trusting, right? And then when we focus on Quebec, the people in Quebec, non-migrants, the level of trust, 36%, right? And then when they migrate to ROC, Ontario, BC, or some other province, they do become a little bit more trusting. 43% say people can be trusted. But the point is that we need to think about whether it's child migration or adult migration. When we only focus on adult migration, we see 33% migrants from Quebec say people can be trusted. In other words, among adult migrants, we do not see people become more trusting. So overall, we see that Canadians who grew up in low trust environment, and then when they migrate to high trust places as an adult, they do not become more trusting, right? And the other way around is that people who grew up in high trust environment, and then when they migrate to low trust places, they do not lose trust, right? So this evidence, or as a individual life event, as a natural experiment, we can use this to suggest that trust is more from cultural socialization. People learn to trust early in life during their primary socialization period of time. Okay. Second experiment is the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, right? So the Quiet Revolution happened during the 1960s, right? And then a few things to talk about before let's establish a few points before getting into how the Quiet Revolution can have any impact on people's trust. So one thing is that trust is much, much lower in Quebec. We talk about this. And then second is that trust is lower among Roman Catholic people, right? And the majority of people in Quebec are religiously Catholic, right? And then the Choir Revolution, the most profound change is that there's a huge, significant, radical decline in the church status and influences in Quebec during the Choir Revolution period of time. So with those observations, we can look at whether the Choir Revolution has any impact. So think about, compare trust before, during, and after the Choir Revolution in Quebec and also outside Quebec, right? So in terms of time, we think about before, during, and after, but we also need to look at whether in Quebec, where the Choir Revolution occurred, and then outside Quebec, where there was no Choir Revolution, and look at over time the change in trust between these two regions, and then in terms of and also the time. So here is the main finding, right? So using the data from 3 cycles of Canadian General Social Survey in 2003, 2008, 2013, for example, in the rest of country, when people are getting older, they become more trusting, right? So this indicate one is aging effect, right? So the research suggests that as people get older, they become a little bit more trusting. So this could also indicate a decline in trust as observed in many Western countries, right? Over time, there's a huge decline in trust. For example, in the United States and also in Canada, there's a decline in trust. So that means younger people tend to have lower trust in general. And then we can see from here, the 3 waves of data from the rest of Canada shows the trend, right? As people get older, trust goes up. But for Quebec, the pattern is the opposite, right? So this is 1960, people who were born during those time. You see, as people, older generation tend to have much, much lower trust than younger generation. And then the turning point we can see is that those people who were born during the Choir Revolution period of time, during 1960, right? So that indicate that people who were socialized during the Choir Revolution period of time have become more trusting over time, right? Even though older people in other places, older people tend to have more trust. But in Quebec, the Choir Revolution changed the pattern. So this also provide a piece of strong evidence showing that socialization or religion as a culture can have huge impact on people's trust, right? So in general, 4 takeaways, thinking about those, how we can do natural experiment using existing survey data. So natural experiment provide a very powerful tool to address many common problems, not just causal effect, but also testing theory, testing mechanism, right? And then in social science research is often underutilized, especially in sociology. We really do natural experiment, and we really do natural experiment using survey data. Of course, I want to also point out that those kind of research design, natural experiment study are not without limitations, right? I don't have much time. I'm not gonna elaborate here about the limitations. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much to our fabulous speakers. So those were 3 fascinating papers. I want to say a couple words about them before we turn to the Q&A. There's one Q&A in the chat for Dan, and there's one Q&A question for Jeff in the Q&A box if you want to take a look, and we'll get to those in a minute. And please, those of you participating, add more questions in either the chat or the Q&A box. What I want to talk about here is just how clever these presentations are, and what you could do with microdata that you can't do with other forms of secondary data. So that the ability to do natural experiments is just it opens up a whole other kind of set of tests that we can do with existing data sets without having to go out and manufacture new surveys and do all that new data collection. You can actually set up this very clever natural experiment using existing microdata that connects across data sets and issues, and in this case, migration and trust. And then in the other 2 papers, we're talking about looking at spatial units of analysis in quite some detail. And this allows us to do evaluations of urban policies that so often use targeting approaches that say, we're going to do this in these special areas because they're particularly in need, whatever the issue is, whether it's economic, social, educational, and so forth. So previously, we often didn't do evaluations of our urban policies because we thought we didn't have the right kind of data, or we had to collect unique data sets for every policy or program we implemented. So here's a very clever use of existing data. So I want to ask our panelists a couple questions about the use of this data. The first is really targeted, so to speak, to Dan and Jeff. And I was wondering, as you spoke, about a couple issues having to do with your spatial units of analysis. And the first, I'd like you guys to explain to the audience of why microdata is so useful in surmounting problems of ecological fallacy, because I think that's what you're able to do here when you're talking about evaluating a specific policy or looking at how neighborhoods change, is you're using microdata to overcome the shortcomings that we always had with the ecological fallacy. So let's start there with that question, if either of you want to take it on.
Hello?
Yeah,
so I don't mind maybe just going first. So I think often the case when in my research looking at neighborhood change and seeing growth of poverty in the suburbs, often something that we see is seeing just generally an income or poverty increasing or decreasing in an area. And that's based off of census data that's aggregated across all the people that live in the neighborhood. And we don't know exactly what's going on for the individual. So it's very hard to make assumptions about how this is actually occurring or where it's coming from, what are the actual drivers to some of these changes. So having this individual data and being able to track people and looking at in these individual effects really kind of helps us. And what we're starting, at least by what I'm starting to look at, is trying to get to look at these very individual effects, even if it's just kind of a first foray into some of this research.
Yeah, so that's right. And so the question that Jeff is answering about, when suburbs change, is it because of new people moving in or because the existing people are becoming poorer in place? That's a classic question that we haven't been able to answer. Is it place or is it people that's changing? And so Jeff is really able to get at these issues. The other question I had for you guys was really about, looking you're using sample data by and large, and do you have issues of margin of error, statistical accuracy, when you're using a 20% sample and you're looking at a small area?
Oh, I guess I'll come in there. I mean, with so with the research I was talking about, we are using data at the dissemination area level, which, for people who are not, census, aficionados, that's the smallest unit. And it's true, there is some more room for error at that level, but it's, I think, the kind of thing that you can come at just by looking at the question from, multiple different angles. So in our case, that's why we use different data sources. We do the same analysis at the dissemination area level, at the census tract level, at the neighborhood level. So we're looking at it at different levels to see consistency across those different levels. And then also with different data sets too, and we see consistency across the different data sets. So I think in general, there's no sort of like knockdown solution to that, but when you look at it from a lot of different angles and you're seeing consistent things across the different angles and the sources, you could feel a lot better about what you're finding.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That often we use a cross-sectional or comparative approach to compensate for the shortcomings of our data on a particular place. So the other major question I had for all the panelists was, actually particularly Dan and Carrie, was on self-selection issues. So, and this is sort of what Steve was getting about in his question in the chat. So for Carrie, I was curious whether the people that migrate, whether they're special in some way, so that maybe the more trusting people migrate out of Quebec, and so that's why you're seeing those types of results. And then the same question for Dan. Aren't these priority areas, aren't they selected based on some criteria, so that maybe you're attributing to the area designation all these impacts, but actually it's the other way around. There's endogeneity there. So curious what you guys have to say.
Dan, you want to go first? Thanks, Karen. That's a very, very good question, right? Thinking about migration can be self-selected. But then in my case is that if we were thinking that people who, like you said, more likely to migrate, they probably are more trusting, right? So the thing is that the pattern shows that in Quebec, when people migrate out to BC or to here in Ontario, they're not becoming more trusting relatively. They still show lower trust, right? But in literature, migration literature, for example, people are more likely to take risk, are more likely to migrate, are generally more trusting, right? But the finding, the data from GSS shows that in Canada, internally, even people who grew up in Quebec, they move out, they still show lower trust. So that's right. So that's even the pattern is even more surprising in terms of like. So it's more like really trust is like learned early on and it's like stabilized early in life.
Right. Dan, did you have a response?
Sure. And maybe should I respond to Steve's question too in that context? Okay, I'll do both. So, I mean, that's a sort of, perennial question, and in some way it's not completely ever answerable, but that's why we take, as best as we can, this matching approach I was talking about. And in the presentation, I don't know if I could, I'll repeat your question, Steve, sorry, when I get to it. That's why we take this matching approach, and which I wasn't able to show, I think, all the details of. But essentially, if you look at it, what we are doing is comparing very small areas on one side of this border to very small areas on the other side of the border. And when we look at their various statistics, they're almost identical, across the board. Not just in their demographics, but also in the built form, the kind of housing you have there, the kind of buildings you have there. We even had data on the amount of tree coverage you have in each place. So you could tell if it's like a leafy green kind of tree covered area. So we have all of that. And of course, I live in Toronto and I've been to all of these places frequently. I live right, near many of them, and I walk around them, and you really don't, they're very kind of invisible lines, and they're not like a stark difference often between walking over the border from one to the other. But the policy creates a very stark difference in some way that wasn't there before. So when we're comparing things, it's possible that there is something we can't observe, some unobserved difference between the places that got designated and didn't, that is somehow accounting for this, but we've thrown everything we could think of that might be accounting for that at it, including crime rates and amount of social assistance in the neighborhoods, and none of that is explaining it as far as we can tell. So that's the best we've done so far, but it's possible, but I'd like to know what that might be and how we could account for it. Now, Steve,
can I jump in with a follow-up question?
Which is, yeah, go
so
ahead.
my follow-up question to that is, I mean, if by definition these are the neighborhoods that are, in quote, decided to be the most in need of additional attention, I mean, how is it that you're able to find so many good matched pairs for neighborhoods? So if all neighborhoods are kind of ordinally scaled on a ranking from 1 to 140, and then these are the 13 at the very bottom of that scale, meaning these are, or sorry, maybe at the very top of the priority scale, then how are you arguing that the next 20 neighborhoods are comparable if they're ordinally below on the very scale that?
So two answers. One is that the selection is made at the neighborhood level at the 100. So again, to get to the census ease, so city of Toronto is divided up by the city into 140 neighborhoods, which are pretty big. Now, what we're looking at is dissemination areas, which are teeny, and there's like 1,000 or so of those, maybe a couple thousand in the city. But the designation is happening at that neighborhood level, the whole neighborhood. But Toronto is an incredibly diverse area, and there's a huge amount of variation within any of those neighborhoods, like the income heterogeneity plots were showing. So yes, on average, the whole neighborhood might be there at lower and some index, but there's going to be a lot of variation there. And it's also often at the physical boundaries is where you're going to have the difference on one side or the other. Point number one. Point number two.
That makes sense. Yeah.
You're also, sure. I mean, you have to remember when they did these ones in 2005, 2006, they were not done very systematically. I mean, there's interesting qualitative research out there on how the process was done, and I won't go over the whole story now, but it was not particularly systematic. It was sort of a hodgepodge of different ways. So now what they do now is they have a bunch of indicators, and they essentially do a factor analysis on those, and they assign factor scores to each of the 140 neighborhoods up to a certain value, and then you're either above or below that value, which still has that same problem, that I said a second ago, but it's a more systematic way of identifying them. Now, there's your other question too, but I've already been going on for a while, so I don't know if I want to kind of monopolize time, but that's a very good question.
It's related. So the other question Steve had posed was, is there an alternative interpretation of the slower growth in price values, one that involves reduced levels of gentrification and more price stability in the priority areas?
Which is a very interesting question, and there's a lot of different facets to it. And so I'll just sort of highlight, I don't know, 3 different aspects that at least you have to think about to address it. One is it's a kind of analytical or empirical kind of question. So we've looked at that, and you do find that, again, on one or the other side of the designation, there is lower growth in BA holders, bachelor's degree holders. So we say that as the index, we treat that as an index of gentrification following the designation. And there's more immigrants settling in the designated areas. That is happening. But does that impact the other things that we found? And we put that in the models, and we try to control for those changes, and it had no effect at all. So in some way, the best we can see that's happening, but it's not affecting, as far as we can see, those impacts on investment and house prices. But I think it also brings up another point, which is, what is the meaning of this outcome? When I say like, oh, the housing prices, were $70,000 or so reduced over that period, that does not mean they got that much more affordable. That's important to keep in mind. Housing is going up like crazy everywhere in Toronto. It's just going up less rapidly there, right? Which is another way of saying we're talking about changes in demand. But this all gets to this because there are supply changes that would correspond, at least that I'm aware of. But this gets to a really more of a normative kind of question, and it brings out some of the complexity here. Again, there's not really an easy answer. it's normative, it's political. So yes, over this, what this could show us is that in this period, it was slightly easier to buy a house for people in the designated areas, and that could be good in many ways. But it also means that there's less equity there for the people who already had their homes, and these are larger immigrant communities, and that difference is basically based on an arbitrary difference about what side of a board, an invisible border you're on. And lastly, we have to ask ourselves, let's say if this is some kind of buffer against gentrification, do we think that it's a good thing to do policies that create policies that induce stigma around neighborhoods in order to, or at least with the effect of reducing their desirability? I mean, I don't know. I think there might be other ways to tackle urban problems around affordability than doing that.
Okay, thank you so much, Dan, for that provocation. And I'm going to go to two interesting questions in the Q&A that haven't been addressed yet. One is from Megan Yu, who asks, do you distinguish social capital between the aggregate level and the individual level? And she says it's for all of you. Question. Do you want to, Carrie, you want to take that?
Yes, like a social capital or even trust is a multi-dimensional concept, right? So in my case, I look at how place level, like Quebec or other like community level social capital or trust of shape people's individual level trust formation, right? So for example, I look at how like people who grew up in low trust environment, then that place level is like a social capital is a place level, and how that shape people's individual level trust, the formation of trust, right? So like how place level affect individual level. So yes, I considered both levels.
Right. Okay. And anybody else want to add to that on how you can measure social capital in the aggregate versus individual?
Well, I'll just jump in there quickly. There's a few, Kerry is selling himself short. He's like one of the, international elite experts on this, and so, I would defer to everything Kerry says on this. And if you want to know anything about trust, Kerry's the one to tell you. But I just to add on to that, there's two kind of, at least a few ways people will do it. One is you'll take people's individual survey responses and then you'll aggregate it, average them to the neighborhood level, and you'll say, okay, there's this sort of average kind of trust level or social capital level at the neighborhood, which is the average of everybody in there. But there's other things that people do too, which I've done a little bit on, and hopefully Carrie and I will collaborate further on this, is looking at the sort of institutional basis in areas, which is something that's kind of more collective and goes beyond the individual. That could mean the set of organizations you have there, community centers, all sorts of local gathering places that provide resources for people to get together, get to know one another, and become a part of a community. And there is good evidence in the past from sociology that have shown, for example, in moments of disaster, for example, there's a famous study of Chicago heat wave that showed places that had a lot of access to those kinds of community level organizations and services were able to be more resourceful in that kind of situation. And that's a sort of focused example, but there are ways we can generalize that and then connect that to now with the microdata to the individual experiences of trust and see how much the availability of those community resources is impacting those individual experiences, or if changes in one or the other are leading to changes in one or the other. So this is really open, interesting area of research.
Thank you so much, Dan. Yeah, and that was the book on the Chicago heat wave is Eric Kleinenberg.
That's right.
Yeah. So I want to go to William's question, William Unger in the Q&A, which has a question for everybody. First of all, he says, you guys are awesome, which I agree. And so he says, what's interesting is how people who may move out of urban areas and into suburbs have to leverage lower rent costs at the expense of poor public transit, greater transportation costs. I wonder how it ties in with the values of those who are in the position of needing to move at the individual level. And so I want you guys to answer that, but I also want you to tell us, since we're all data geeks here, tell us what data you would use and what cool data sets you could merge together to answer a question like that.
So a very good question, and this is related to the first question, Karen, about self-selection, right? But that's the way why we use, for example, aggregate level, neighborhood level data, and also individual level data, right? So when we have individual level data from surveys, then we can control a lot of things, right? Income, right? Housing, ownership, and then some other like social status. Right? So in the model, we can control all those individual backgrounds, right? So if we just look at the neighborhood level data, we won't be able to control like that, but people moving to different neighborhood or into different places. But with individual macro level data, then we will be able to control the like lot of individual level backgrounds. So they provide better estimation.
I'll just jump in there as well about maybe other possible data. As I looked a little bit at the survey of household spending, which may be something super interesting emerging with some of the other panel data sets that we have that would have individual spending on rent, but also has really interesting variables on spending on public transit, different modes of transportation, car, gas, car payments, and all that other information as well.
Well, one thing I'll just add is because we're, very fortunate to have Steve Farber here with us, and who's a really top Canadian researcher on these kind of transportation issues. And we were just talking about that, almost this exact question, and we're the answer is some of these surveys that Jeff was just mentioning, but it's also administrative data sources that are held by provincial and federal governments, like, for example, auto registration data, insurance data. And one of the exciting developments in the RDC network of late is getting more of those administrative data sets into the RDC that we can then link with the income data, we can link with other survey data, we can even link sometimes with the census. So that's the sort of hope that we have to start to make those connections with governments who have those data, to put us all together so we can do research that would be interesting and informative to them, but also important for scholarly work as well.
Yeah, I think that there's also, this doesn't answer the question, but I think that there's also the possibility that the types of data that we are collecting in national surveys isn't the right type of data that can answer that question, at least in the space around kind of the reasons that people are moving, residential locations, whether or not people how people value access to different modes of transportation, or value access to different types of destinations in their neighborhood, for example. We don't really have that data yet, and it doesn't exist in the GSS. I mean, there might be an odd wave that has a question or two that seems relevant to that, but it's not something that we can have like a longitudinal account of or anything like that. But one of the exciting things about a project that I'm developing now called Mobilizing Justice is that we will be collecting a new national survey in collaboration with StatsCan on, we haven't named it yet, but generally speaking, the topic is transportation barriers or transport poverty, and we really plan to ask these questions directly of a national representative sample. And we've partnered with StatsCan to be able to link that data to administrative records. So we will be able to bring in tax file data and other kind of administrative data. And the data will be deposited in the RDC when we're done with our primary research using the data. So one option for getting into answering these difficult to answer questions is sometimes you do need to, I know the world is moving away from collecting more data and trying to get at data passively, but sometimes we do need to collect new surveys and make them available, and that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm being warned here that we're going over time, and I'm getting the So we will have to put an end to this conversation. Obviously, we could go on for hours, being a collection of data nerds, and glad to be with an audience of data nerds as well, like-minded folks. So thank you so much to the panelists, including our surprise guest panelist, Steve Farber. And thank you so much to the audience. And I just want to remind you all that the next session is tomorrow at 1 p.m. in Eastern Time, 1 p.m. It's in partnership with QICCS. It's called Focus on Children's Health and Well-Being. And there's still time to register for that session if you have not yet had a chance to do so. So thank you so much. See you all around.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having me.